Being Black in America comes with its challenges. However, we understand that enlightenment through education is the oppressor's worst fear. By bridging the gap between academia and the people, our purpose is to equip you with knowledge that breaks down barriers during your journey towards truth and freedom. Welcome to the Black and Highly Dangerous Podcast.
What's up, Dav? How you doing?
Pretty good, Ty. Just actually ate a really good salad. That's really random, but I'm on my health kick again. I'm going to Miami in like 2 weeks, so trying to low carb it up so I can look good in the pictures.
Okay, yeah, ain't nothing eating green and salads. And what kind of salad dressing you use?
Okay, so yeah, that's where I could have been a little bit better. I ate like some Catalina dressing, which is not the best.
It's not too bad though.
It has a lot of sugar in it though, but yeah.
I mean, at least you're getting your vegetables in. I've been good, you know. This past week has been good. Been busy doing some events on campus and stuff like that, and just continuing to live that tenure life, working, trying to write, trying to do everything. Whatever it is.
Yeah, I know that feeling. Friday, I actually turned in like a pre-proposal kind of for my dissertation, and it took me like 3 weeks to write those 4 pages. But I feel like it feels good because I'm like, wow, I actually have a question. I have a topic. So I'm in a very good place right now.
You doing anything fun this past week?
No, literally, I was like, I would wake up, work out, do work, cook, and like go to sleep. It was because the pre-proposal was due Friday for a fellowship. It was just complete grind mode. And it's funny because when I was finished with it on, Friday night, Saturday I was just like really upbeat and just like, just having fun. And John was like, wow, like, I guess those deadlines really make a difference. I'm like, yes.
It's like, I get my wife back after them deadlines.
Cause my mood was just like completely just off. Like, I don't have time to talk to you. I don't have time for nothing.
I gotta get this paper out. Yeah, that's how it is. I went to a play last night, and it wasn't a play. It was actually my first time going to a stage reading. And the play was called Every 28 Hours. And it was pretty cool. It was about pretty much every 28 hours, a Black person dies, I think, by a shooting or something along those lines. And it really focused on police brutality and shootings and, had narratives from, it was like actually, I believe if I remember correctly, it was 72 1-minute plays. And they were like in 3 sections. And it was a stage reading. So it was my first time with that kind of experience. It was really, really good. Students did a great job with really highlighting almost everything. In 72 1-minute plays, you have opportunity to highlight pretty much everything from community to protest to the mothers to, the experiences of people who experience that kind of violence in their community. So I enjoyed that. And I really don't go to those kind of things. So maybe I'll start going a little bit more, I know.
Get some culture. Some culture
be part of that high culture life. You feel me? Start going to some operas and whatnot.
Right? Hip operas.
Oh, yeah, hip hop. What is it? Hip hop operas? What is it? Hip operas?
Yeah, hip operas.
Yeah, hip operas. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. But, and I guess in thinking about, culture and entertainment, although that's a very different type of entertainment, I've noticed in the entertainment industry as of late there has been a very interesting conversation going on around colorism. All right, have you heard about, so like there was recently an interview on the Breakfast Club. They were interviewing the Latina rapper Amara La Negra, and she was talking about her experiences, with colorism. And it kind of led to kind of gaslighting with Charlamagne, essentially asking her, was it all in her head? And I thought that was really interesting. There was also like the case of, I think, Gilbert Arenas, like going out of his way to comment on some of Lupita's photos, you know, with, you know, making comments like, oh, Lupita, you know, she looks better in the dark, and, you know, little comments like that. And so I feel like we've been having more conversations as a community around colorism, what that looks like. Is it real? You know, what are its impacts? And so, I thought.
Yeah, with that whole Charlamagne and the Breakfast Club interview and DJ Envy, they did receive a lot of flack for that. And it was interesting because, you know, Charlamagne, he was saying things like, you know, I don't see it. You know, I don't see it in Hollywood. He thinks times have changed a lot. And asking him, you know, are you sure it's not in your mind? And he got a lot of flack for it. And I also listened to his Brilliant Idiots podcast, and he kind of addressed it on there too. And he said he felt that she was talking about two things. You know, one is just the industry, and then another was colorism, and he was kind of confused. He admitted as far as what direction she was trying to take it in. And, you know, he admitted that there are some things he needs to learn a little bit more of because he just didn't know. And he also, you know, was like, he's always been known to ask questions if he just is not sure. But I think she really was trying to highlight a lot of what goes on as far as just colorism, skin tone, and how we address it as a society, how we look at it. And even within our community, you know, light skin versus dark skin, even on that very show, The Breakfast Club, which is kind of interesting how, you know, he addresses saying they don't talk about, but him and Envy always throw jokes at each other all the time. He literally calls DJ Envy a waffle colored Negro. You know?
I've heard,
So he does understand it. It's a part of the community and a part of the narrative. But I think, in broader context, we do need to begin to have more serious conversations as far as how that impacts people, and how it has and where it stems from and the history of colorism, which is why I'm really excited to talk about it today with our special guest, Trina Jones, on the topic, who spent a lot of time and effort and research really highlighting colorism, doing research on it, and how it pertains to certain circumstances in the law as well.
I agree, because I do think what Charlamagne said, and I didn't hear his Brilliant Idiots podcast, but it talks about, you know, he mentioned his need for more education, you know, very serious conversations. I'm pretty sure, you know, the thing about Charlamagne is that he's willing to ask questions that other people aren't willing to ask. I don't think he's the only person that probably wants to know to what extent is this a real thing, or, you know, is it just someone getting their feelings hurt, you know, about, you know, something petty, and that, you know, it really has nothing to do with colorism. So I think it is time that we start having these real conversations with facts and not feelings to see like what is the deal with colorism in society and in the Black community. So like you said, I'm really excited as well to talk to Trina Jones. Yeah.
And these are conversations I know we all have had if you are a part of really any community of color, right? It definitely happens within the Latino community, but it's for sure within the Black community and African American communities. And there's always been talk of certain privileges being afforded to those who are lighter skinned and those who are darker skinned having a tougher time, or, you know, that whole debate as far as attractiveness, and even stemming from what we all heard of, you know, house Negro, field Negro during the slavery times, and how that all has been a part of embedded in our kind of cultural DNA, and still is prevalent today in a lot of ways. So hopefully you guys will be informed in this conversation. We'll learn a lot. And again, just pay particular attention to, you know, not just how it happens in the law, but the history of where it comes from. And I think it'll make a lot of sense of this, how we have these conversations and why we're having them, and what they truly mean within our own social networks. All right, but you ready to get this show on the road, Dad?
Ready to go.
All right, see y'all in a little bit. In the United States and within the Black community, discussions around race and discrimination have often focused on racism and intergroup bias. Rarely have conversations about race thoughtfully and productively tackled racism's subtle cousin, colorism. Colorism is defined as the differential treatment of same-race individuals on the basis of skin color. The lack of attention to colorism has contributed to misconceptions and questions about whether it truly exists outside the minds of those impacted by it, the extent to which fair-skinned people are harmed by colorism, its relevance outside of the Black community, and whether tackling colorism undermines the collective fight to end racism. Today, we address those questions and misconceptions with Professor Trina Jones, a professor at Duke Law School and leading expert on colorism. She has published a number of articles on skin color and the law, intergroup racial preferencing, and discrimination. We're happy to have her on BHD. Welcome, Professor Trina Jones.
So we really want to start this interview by just asking you a little bit more about yourself and how did you get into, how did you choose the current path of being a law professor, and specifically also focusing on your research related to colorism?
So I grew up in Rock Hill, South Carolina, and my mother was a union organizer, a single mother of 4 children. And I was always interested because of her work and because I saw her organizing various textile plants in the Southeast and issues of socioeconomic inequality. That led me to law school. Unfortunately, I was diverted. Well, not unfortunately, but I was diverted briefly to Big Law, which is a big law firm in Washington, D.C., after law school. But eventually I found my way back to social justice issues through teaching. And I chose to look at colorism because my work focused on discrimination law. And I thought that we weren't addressing the nuances within race and racism with sufficient detail and care in the legal academy. And so colorism is a very nuanced form of racism, at least within the United States. And I wanted to bring greater attention to that and to the more complex ways in which racism operates in contemporary U.S., in the contemporary U.S.
So I guess for our listeners, can you give us a definition of what exactly is colorism?
So colorism is making distinctions among same-race individuals on the basis of skin tone, the relative darkness or lightness of the skin. So, for example, if one were to think about, I'm just going to use 2 common, fairly well-known individuals, Beyonce and India Arie, right? Beyonce is fairly light in terms of her skin tone, and India Arie is darker. Some people might be drawn to an individual with a lighter skin tone, right, for a variety of different reasons that are grounded in history.
No, it's really interesting that you say that. I really appreciate your work because I feel like colorism or skin tone differentiation is something that we maybe talk about within a community, but I didn't necessarily feel that it got a lot of scholarly attention to actually see, like, what role is this playing, like, in life outcomes, in, larger outcomes. So I really appreciate your attention to that. I guess you kind of mentioned that it was it's been like something that's historical. I guess if you can talk a little bit more about, like, I guess the history of colorism, like where it comes from. I know in some of your work you mentioned like the 1-drop rule. So I guess if you can just kind of talk about like how and where this emerged.
Yeah, so I'll say a couple of things on that. One, colorism, which is also known as shadeism, is not unique to the United States. When we look more broadly, globally, we see a color hierarchy in different places. In Asia, it's quite prevalent. In South America, in Central America. So universally, you have this color hierarchy, and hopefully we can circle back to that because the way in which color plays out and the salience that it has varies depending upon social context. Okay. So in the United States, many people, including myself, point to the colonial era and the era of slavery as part of the origins of the color hierarchy, right? So Europeans came to the United States, or what is currently known as the United States. Europeans, of course, were white. They needed a justification for slavery, and racial ideologies arose from that. During the colonial era and the era of slavery, you had racial intermixing, which produced a population of Black people who had varying skin tones. Some of those individuals were the product of involuntary unions between slave owners and Black enslaved women, and their children had a lighter skin tone. Some of those men accorded privileges to their children. Some children were manumitted, were freed upon the slave owner's death. Some of them worked inside in the house as opposed to in the fields. And so you could see this hierarchy developing over time, right, based upon certain advantages that lighter toned enslaved persons received, right? And these advantages were passed down through generations, right? Which resulted in some of the economic differences that we've seen historically within the Black community, where you have this color hierarchy affecting access to educational opportunity, which would then affect access to employment and other forms of income development and wealth development. So many scholars will trace the development of the color hierarchy to that period in U.S. history.
Interesting. That's fascinating because I was reading your paper in Shades of Brown. I found that, and I think you have alluded to this too in one of the footnotes, saying that you've had similar conversations. And I think this is common within the Black community, conversations with family members or with friends about the differences that we may or may not observe dealing with colorism in a lot of ways, or shades of Blackness or darkness within our own communities. And I feel that a lot of the times the conversation, kind of goes back to that focus on the field Negro or the house Negro in a lot of ways. But in your article, you kind of outline the historical implications and how it was a little bit more nuanced than that. And one way being in the Upper South, where there were a lot of interracial relationships or marriages or children being born, biracial children being born, or mulattoes, what they called them during that time period. It would seem that because, what I found from your readings is that class played a big role in that, where it was still kind of unacceptable, and the children coming from these mixed relationships were still viewed as Black and treated as such. Whereas in the Lower South, which traditionally has the, reputation of being extremely conservative and racist in a lot of ways, were a little bit more accepting, because the mulattoes being born were from the heritage or bloodline of wealthy white men, and there were less of them, but they were usually afforded the privileges of whites. And then I also found it interesting how social temperament and climate played a role, because when the Civil War began to get closer, then we started to see this two-class system begin to develop in the South, where now mulattoes are being treated more as Black than they were as white. And I find that kind of interesting, how class did play a role within the kind of distribution of feelings or sentiments of people who were of lighter skin, and how they were being accepted socially and legally in many ways.
Yeah, so I want to point to one thing that's come up in the conversation that we haven't addressed explicitly. There is conversation within the African-American community about colorism, right? We've talked about this within our families. We still talk about it today. It's been a historic phenomenon that has had real consequences, but colorism is not limited, and I've tried to make this point in my research, to the Black community or the Latino or Latinx community or Asian communities. White individuals also engage in colorism. So I'll go back to your question about history and the role of class and so on and so forth in a second. And we've seen this in terms of casting, right, for major roles in Hollywood productions.
Yes.
If you look historically at who has been cast, let's say when you're looking at a female role in a female romantic lead, that casting it tends to gravitate towards someone who looks like Halle Berry as opposed to someone who looks like Viola Davis. Now, to be sure, Viola Davis was cast as a lead in Fences, but know that that's a production that focused primarily on Black actors. I'm talking about a production that would include white actors, something along the lines of a Monsters Ball, right? You don't see Black female actresses who are of darker skin tone being cast in romantic leads. So, and those casting decisions historically have been made by white individuals, right? So white people are not oblivious to skin tone differences. If you look at commercials these days, yes, there's more diversity in televised commercials, but if you look at the people of color, the Black individuals who are being chosen, particularly with regards to women, they tend to be of lighter skin tone. And it's not just skin tone, but the hair tends to be of a certain texture as well, right? So those decisions are not necessarily being made by Black individuals. So you see it in terms of marketing and advertising who white individuals are choosing, right, to represent their products. We also saw it in the 2008 presidential election when Barack Obama was a candidate for the presidency. Joe Biden famously said in commenting on Barack Obama's appeal and saying that, he was a promising candidate. And I quote Biden, who said, I mean, you got the first mainstream African-American who is articulate and bright and clean and a nice looking guy. I mean, that's a storybook man, right? Now, bright in that quote can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. But he's talking about Obama's persona, right? And I think that for some people, the fact that he was of a lighter skin tone, based upon his biracial ancestry, was important, right? And I think Harry Reid may have nailed it in terms of skin tone more directly, because at the time he said that Obama was a promising candidate because he was a light-skinned, that's Harry Reid, who was a senator at the time, light-skinned African-American. And I'll quote him as well. He said, with no Negro dialect unless he wanted to have one. Right? Mm-hmm. So he's pointing to skin tone. These are white men of some prominence and power commenting on Barack Obama and his light skin tone, directly in the case of Harry Reid, more indirectly in the case of Joe Biden, but certainly one could read some sort of color preferencing, at least identity performance preferencing in Joe Biden's comment. So I just want to underscore that it's not just people of color who are fixated on color or are focused and attentive to color differences. White individuals are as well.
It's interesting that you say that because, in those conversations that we have online or in our living rooms, there is the question, or I've often seen a lot of pushback against the idea that white people or non-Black people notice skin tone differences among Black people. And it's often a pushback. And I think some of that may come from the idea of we have to be solid and show solidarity together. We are all Black, and acknowledging that outsiders might also notice these differences. I guess somehow, I don't know. It might strike people as you're saying that I am more privileged than you in a sense. I don't know if that's where it comes from, but I have noticed a pushback against the idea that outsiders also notice our differences.
So you're saying that with your communications among people of color, that there's been some resistance to the idea that white individuals are also noticing color differences?
Yeah, it might be a comment when white people see us, we're all Black. They just see us as Black. And there might be pushback from others to say, no, I'm pretty sure they notice, and they might gravitate toward some type of, some type of Black people more than others. But I noticed a pushback against the idea, white people don't see this. They just kind of see us all. They just see Black when they see me.
Well, Daphne, I think you're raising an important point, and that for purposes of this conversation. So we're focused on colorism, and I think that it's really important that people not confuse colorism and racism, although there are important similarities between the two. So yes, when you think in terms of racial categories and who is Black, and I use the term Black as a universal phrase to reference all people who are brown regardless of country of origin. So Black would include people on the continent of Africa, people from South and Central America, people all over, right? Whereas African American, I used to point to brown people in the United States who trace their ancestry back to slavery, right? So when you think about race, right, I do think that many people feel that people don't differentiate within races, right, on the basis of skin tone. Either you're Black or you're white or you're Asian or you're Latinx, and the nuances don't matter that much. So there is that view that's been articulated by many people, but that's racial categorization, right? That is focusing on certain indicators like color or hair texture or facial features, the fullness of the nose, the thickness or fullness of the lips, the shape of the eyes, right? Those sorts of things, and then ascribing meaning to those and creating racial categories, right? Colorism colorism is slightly different, right? It's saying, okay, we have these racial categories in place, and sometimes within those categories, people will differentiate, right? And they will differentiate based upon socioeconomic class. So a person who has a degree from Harvard, who speaks in a certain way, who works in a certain place may be more acceptable than someone who doesn't have those credentials. So they may differentiate based upon class, but they also differentiate based upon gender, right? So in some situations, a Black male may be more appealing for, let's say, a particular position, an employment position, than, say, a Black female might be. And my argument is that they also differentiate based upon skin tone. So yes, some people will make really broad distinctions based upon race, but there are times, and this is the importance of this research, when individuals will differentiate, make more nuanced distinctions within the category of Black or African American. And that's what my research is focused on, right? Those sort of nuanced distinctions. Maybe everyone doesn't make them. Some people still abide by the one drop rule. If you have one drop of Black blood in your ancestry, based upon biological notions of race, or one drop of chocolate in the milk, so to speak, then you're Black and nothing else matters, right? But I think that doesn't really capture everything that's happening in our complex social. In this complex social moment, right? I do think that people are making more nuanced distinctions, and we need to pay attention to those distinctions so that we don't assume that if X, Y, and Z in the race are gaining prominence, that means that everybody in the race is going to do well as a consequence.
Oh, interesting. I think, also within these conversations that I think many people have a lot of times, and I think this is what kind of Daphne was saying too earlier, the inclusion of scholarly work, academic work, right? And I mean, that's just something that people usually don't bring into their everyday conversations with close friends and family members. But within these debates that they are having, probably at the dinner table or what have you, of lighter skinned people faring better in many circumstances than darker skinned people, is there evidence to support that claim? Do we actually see this happening? I know you mentioned that we've seen it definitely in media and in movies and things of that nature, but do we see it more generally in employment, education, just more privilege and access to opportunities for those people who are light-skinned? Is there actual factual truth to that statement?
So economists are looking at that question today. And my colleague here at Duke, Sandy Darity, who is an economist, has been looking at some of the economic consequences of skin tone, right? And his research suggests that lighter toned individuals, in fact, do fare better in terms of income and life outcomes. Margaret Hunter has done some work. She's a sociologist along these lines, also pointing to the fact that economically, lighter toned individuals do tend to do better and on many metrics. So the research is fairly new, but it's evolving. But there is evidence to support that lighter toned individuals have historically and still do in the United States fare better with regards to income and educational opportunity than darker toned individuals. Now, we're in a dynamic social context that may be changing, right? So we'll have to see where the research goes in future years, but there is data to support that. And I would point you to Sandy Darity, William Darity's work in part. There's also other research coming out of Princeton. Ellis Monk, who is a sociologist there, is doing research on some of the health consequences of discrimination, and his work specifically focuses on color discrimination, colorism, and shadism. And what he is showing by looking at what's happening in the United States, and he's also done some comparative work in Brazil, is that skin tone differences actually manifest in terms of health outcomes, a higher propensity for certain illnesses. For example, high blood pressure, heart disease, those sorts of things are associated broadly with discrimination. And his work is focusing on skin tone differences and the relationship between that variable and health outcomes. So the data is emerging, but we're seeing these associations.
I actually got to see Professor Ellis Monk give a talk on his research, and it was really interesting. And after the fact, I read an article, and it kind of, I guess, aligns with Professor Darity's research that shows there's an article that he has, like skin tone stratification among Black Americans. And it was kind of like looking at data from the 50s through the 80s, but also seeing like whether those differences in stratification by skin color carried over into like the current period. And he actually did find that skin tone is associated with Black Americans' educational attainment, household income, occupational status, and even the skin tone and educational attainment of their spouses. And it was just interesting because when I saw his talk, I was just like, wow, there's just like not a lot of research. So like I said, I'll just say again, I just really appreciate the work you're doing, the work of like Professor Monk, because it's just like, I think we have lots of opportunities when we take what we think is common sense, but we actually back it up with data, or we refute it with data, because maybe our assumptions about certain things don't work out. So again, just shout out to you about this work.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you.
With, when as you were talking and this comes to my mind when I'm thinking about colorism, and I'm thinking about, so yes, we are seeing, and we have always seen this evidence of how colorism plays out within the Black community and how it affords certain advantages to others. And I'm trying to figure out socially how, when we have these conversations about things that happen internally within the Black community, how can we have these conversations, right? Because on one end, I can see it being, if a light-skinned person, right, gets a role, perhaps, right? And on one end, people may be saying, oh, you only got that role because you're light-skinned, et cetera. But there might be some truth to that, right? But moving forward as a community, I feel like this can be, and I think it has been in some ways, created a divide in some instances, right? But how can we have this conversation without creating a divide? How can we tackle, because I think traditionally we're just used to having the binary, conflict of Black versus white. And I think it's easier to digest and converse about. But now when we're talking about these kind of internal differences or intraracial differences, I think the conversation becomes a little bit more challenging, right? And far as, are we blaming other people for getting privilege because of their lighter skin tone? And those who are darker may have more challenging experiences, but how do we as a community maybe try to address this in some way?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. I want to issue one caveat, right? So the color hierarchy does tend to privilege lightness, right? The closer you are to white, the better you seem to fare on a variety of different dimensions, socially, politically, economically, and so on and so forth. But it all depends upon context, right? So there are situations where lighter toned individuals are harmed. Right? So you can imagine a scenario where you might have some sort of organization that really privileges Blackness, right? That's trying to celebrate African American history and our contemporary presence, and sort of a modern version of "I'm Black and I'm proud," or "The blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice." That sort of notion. And in that context, lighter tone individuals might actually not be privileged, right? So it really does depend upon context. There are stories of lighter toned individuals who feel as if they've been shunned by aspects of the or subgroups within the African American community because they are light, right? And so we can't overlook that harm that does happen. So generally, the color hierarchy, yes, privileges lightness, but there are contexts where white individuals feel as if they have been left out or shunned or treated poorly, right, because of their lighter skin tones. As to your question about how do we as an African Americans or as Black people in the United States not allow this sort of conversation to divide us, I think that we have to be attentive to the ways in which we're differently situated if we are to move ahead as a group, right? So when I hear that question, I hear people saying, historically, we can't focus on sexism within the African American community because we really need to focus on racism, right? Or we can't focus on classism within the African American community because race is, has to be our first priority. But that ignores that people are differently situated within the community, right? And if you don't address the ways in which people are differently situated, if you don't address the sexism to which Black women are subject, right? If you don't address the poverty within the community and just focus on individuals who are doing well economically, then when progress happens, it may happen only for a subset of the community, and the rest will not necessarily prosper. And I'm making the same argument with regards to skin color. We've got to address this particular issue if we want all people within the community, regardless of skin tone or hue, right, to progress. If there's a preference in terms of marriage, in terms of dating, in terms of employment, in terms of elected officials for those who have lighter skin tones, then you might see more people of color, more Black people being elected. But if it's only a subgroup of the race, right, then I'm not sure that that's the sort of progress that we want to embrace. Yeah. We need to embrace progress that's going to be inclusive of everybody in the community. So I sort of resist these ideas that we can't look with greater nuance and care at the ways in which we're differently situated, because that's just going to lead to a lack of unity among people of color. I think addressing the complexities of our identity, the complexity of our group will actually bring us closer, right? Mm-hmm.
So kind of along the same lines, like how do we start having those conversations? Because I feel like a lot of this might come from like a place of hurt, or it's kind of like you mentioned, like the sexism thing. Like I've engaged in many conversations about this, and it's kind of like you want me to acknowledge a privilege that I don't think I have in terms of like maybe my gender identity, or you want me to acknowledge a privilege that I have in terms of class. And, we're all Black. So like, it's kind of like, how do we have these conversations without people feeling attacked and with people being willing to like maybe embrace aspects of their privilege, I guess?
Well, it's not a question of blame, right? I think we need to understand where colorism comes from and why it has salience, right? So you've got to keep the larger frame in mind. We live in a context, social context, where race is salient and where whiteness, and I'm not speaking in terms of individuals, I'm speaking in terms of the concept, whiteness is privileged, right? And the color hierarchy has meaning in this particular context because of that racial hierarchy, right? Whites on top, people of color on the bottom, and maybe if you believe Eduardo Bonilla Silva's work, there's some intermediate group that's forming as demographics change in the country, right? So the color hierarchy has meaning because of the racial hierarchy. So people need to understand that colorism in the United States is a result of racism, right? It's a product of colonization, right? Europeans were white. They brought these ideas of white privilege, of whiteness being superior to the colonial United States. They enslaved Africans, right? And they passed these ideas along. So this is part of the social fabric of the United States. When we address colorism, what we're doing is pushing back against ideas of white supremacy. So to say to a brother or sister that, lightness has privilege is not to say that that person is not deserving of whatever they have. It's to say that in this social context, right, you may have been privileged, right, because whiteness has value. Right. So it's not an accusatory game towards that person. People just need to understand how we're differently situated because we live in a racist society where color, right, has a huge amount of meaning. So I think if people understand that, then it's not this sort of pointing the finger at somebody saying you don't deserve X, Y, and Z. It's saying you are where you are, in part because of your efforts, but also in part because you have certain physical features that are prized in this social context. And people have to acknowledge that.
Yeah, I think that currently we can begin to see that. And I mean, this is just my personal opinion of what I've been witnessing going on with more conversations centered around race and progression in that regard. I feel that, and I think you may have said this in the article too. I think you said that there was a strengthening of the alliance between lighter skinned or mixed race folks and Black people during like the Black Panther Black Power movement in the 60s. And I think that today we're kind of seeing a similar resurgence of that with the Black Lives Matter and the people that are speaking out, right, making a large strides for the community, like Colin Kaepernick, like Jesse Williams, and even people like Barack Obama, right, who are mixed, who are lighter skinned, but seem to be accepted fairly well within the community, within the media, especially with the message that they're trying to portray and of progression and addressing issues like racism. And it seems to be much more of an embrace with, people who are light skinned and are using their platform and their privilege, right, to kind of combat this racism machine that we all are really trying to combat.
I think that's right. And there are also dark skinned people, right, who are carrying forth a message of racial solidarity, right? Definitely. So you have Viola Davis and Hollywood, right? Al Sharpton. So I think it's a wide array of individuals who are carrying forth the message that there is racism, is pervasive in the United States, and it needs to be addressed. This isn't really, to go back to Daphne's observation, this isn't about blame, right? This is recognizing that we are in a social context where for over 400 years, right? Whiteness has been valued and darkness has been denigrated. And it's part of the language that we use. Think about phrases like white knight, right? Daytime being viewed as, desirable, and dark, night being somehow sinister and to be feared, right? So it's blacklist in our language, right? In our the images to which many of us were subject when we were kids. When you think about childhood princesses, right, and heroes, right? They were for the most part until recently white, right? So it's encoded in our language, it's encoded in the imagery that we see. And I think that we need to understand, right, the ways in which all of this language about color, right, will affect the way in which we are viewed by others and the way in which we view each other. And it's not about blame, it's about understanding, right? So that we can all progress in a variety of different ways in society equally.
No, I think that's a really good observation, and I hope we can definitely move toward that. You kind of mentioned and kind of thinking about Terrell's question about the role of particularly like biracial activists and like pushing forward an agenda like related to racial justice and social justice. You also mentioned Professor Eduardo Bonilla Silva and his theory or his work about like a potential like triracial categorization. They have it in Brazil and like its potential to develop in the United States. And it's interesting because one thing I have noticed is also like a movement for biracial, Black, white biracials to embrace their like mixed heritage, like kind of like a pushback against the one drop rule. And like there was even like this like YouTube documentary, something like I'm biracial, not Black, damn it, or something like that. And like, so I guess I want to know your thoughts on that. Like, do you see us like moving toward that to where it's like a triracial category or a triracial system to where it's like white, like these mixed or racially ambiguous and then kind of like dark Black? Like, could you see that at all emerging in the U.S.?
I am definitely intrigued by the concept. We've seen it before. So Terrell mentioned earlier differences between the Upper South and the Lower South. Part of what happened in the Lower South was you had large numbers of African slaves, right? Enslaved people. And sometimes when you have a small number of elites, they need a buffer, right? They want to increase their numbers in order to decrease the possibility of some form of revolt, right? So that's happened historically in parts of the United States, also in parts of Brazil. A legal scholar named Tanya Hernandez has written prolifically and persuasively about the use of buffers in times when people feel as if people on the top of the hierarchy feel as if their numbers are decreasing. And so what you want to do is to create this buffer category between you and those who are at the very bottom of the hierarchy to sort of decrease the power of those at the bottom. And so I think Bonilla Silva is making an observation based upon contemporary demographic trends, where we see, right, an increasing number of Latinx individuals, right, and some concerns among whites about their numbers decreasing, right? So in this moment, what he's positing is that what will happen is that some individuals who are in what he calls the collective Black. So if you imagine a triangular hierarchy, you have the collective Black on the bottom. And this is not just African Americans, but it would include certain groups from certain parts of Asia, right? As well as Native Americans. So on the bottom, but what you might have is some cherry picking among those individuals. So perhaps lighter toned Latinos, lighter toned Blacks or biracial Black, white individuals, and successful Japanese, Korean, and Chinese Americans, successful groups within the Asian American community. Those might be persons who are honorary whites, not quite white, so they're not at the top of the hierarchy, but they're in the middle. And to the extent that those individuals embrace their differences, right, we are better than the collective Black, right, those people who are not like us, then what you have is the inability of those people who are racialized as Black or brown in the United States to actually come together in some form of social protest or opposition to the racial hierarchy in the United States. So I think that to some extent you can see this materializing. There are fractures within communities, right? So Japanese, Korean, and Chinese Americans, some individuals within that group may differentiate themselves from Filipinos or those from Vietnam or Laos and so on and so forth. You might see, and we have seen some African Americans who are lighter differentiating them, or biracial differentiating themselves, as you just suggested, Daphne, from darker toned blacks, right? So if you see this, or higher, those with a higher socioeconomic class differentiating themselves from those who are of lower economic classes, right, within the Black community. If those differences begin to have meaning to people, right, then you can see the emergence of this three-tiered hierarchy. And that serves the interests of those on the top, because then what you have are those in the middle saying, well, we're not like those other people, right? We are better than them in certain dimensions, and we're going to distance ourselves from those individuals. Note what that does in terms of speaking to the possibility of resisting a capitalistic system, right, that seeks to subordinate people of color. Right. So I think that Bonilla Silva's observations are important, and, maybe playing out.
I think I kind of want to move to, what I think is, part of what you have been contributing and are contributing to the field when we talk about colorism and the legal settings in the courts in particular. And I think it's interesting. I think people should, we should have a conversation about this for our listeners as well, how colorism plays a role within the court system, anti-discrimination, Title VII, all the above. I think when we traditionally or generally think about the courts, and anti-discrimination, of course, it's probably easier to visibly understand, right? If it's a Black person versus a white person, and anti-discrimination lawsuits, if it's a man versus a woman. But I think it gets a little bit more complicated when we are looking again with these intra-group differences, and things like colorism can arise, and how I think you outlined pretty well how it's not really where it should be when the courts are trying to really address race and colorism, and not really finding a solid distinction yet in a lot of the precedences and the cases that have been happening with that kind of distinction.
Yeah, I'll get to that question in 1 second. Can I go back for a second to Daphne's observation about biracial persons saying that they're not really Black? You have to sort of deconstruct what's being said in that moment, right? So don't label me as Black because let's assume that one parent is white and one parent is Black. I'm biracial. I want to express all aspects of my heritage. For many people, they find that argument sympathetic, but you have to query what's going on in that moment. If whiteness and Blackness had the same value in our society, nobody would be saying, I'm not Black, right? So generally it's not, someone's classifying you as white and you want to celebrate your Black heritage. It's the opposite, right? You're being characterized as Black and you want to celebrate your white heritage because there's privilege, right, associated with that white heritage. So in that moment when the person is saying, I'm not Black, it's almost because Blackness has negatives associated with it, right? Mm-hmm. And so by invoking this concept of whiteness, it's creating some privilege for that individual. Exactly what Eduardo Bonilla was describing, right? Separating yourself out from the rest of the Black community and trying to say, well, I'm different in this way. And in a social context where Blackness and whiteness don't carry the same weight, right? They're not treated with the same value. Claiming whiteness, right, is claiming some privilege. So I just wanted to make that point. With regards to, and Tanya Hernandez has written about that in a Maryland Law Review article about 10 or 15 years ago, entitled Multiracial Discourse, where she talks about what's happening in that moment when you say I'm not Black, I'm biracial, especially when you're talking about Black, white, biracials, right? What you're doing is trying to invoke some of the privileges of whiteness. And we've got to realize that those two are not equivalent in our society and what's happening in that moment. With regards to The law. I think the first point that is important for people to know is that it's hard to win any discrimination claim in the court system. If you have a straight race claim, white person is chosen for the position, and you are Black, and you're saying you've been discriminated against because of your race, it's going to be incredibly difficult to actually prevail on that claim, because for a variety of the reasons, including the fact that some people don't think that race is as prevalent today as it was historically, and because of some requirements in the law in terms of showing intent, right? So if you don't believe that racism is pervasive, and if the plaintiff is required to show intentional discrimination and people aren't leaving smoking gun trails, emails attesting to their racial bias, it's going to be hard to prove that claim, right? So race claims are difficult to prove. A color claim is going to be even more difficult to prove, because what you're saying in a color case is, a colorism case is, okay, my white boss, right, hires people of color, African Americans, right, but that boss prefers African Americans who are of a lighter skin tone. Right? So a jury is going to sit back and likely say, wait a second, this person hires African Americans and you're saying that they still discriminate? How does that work? Right? So I think that that's going to be one of the challenges, and that is one of the challenges that you'll see in these color cases. People just don't believe that someone who will hire African Americans is going to differentiate among African Americans based upon skin tone. And so what you have to do is to educate the fact finder and show how intergroup differences matter in other contexts, right? So you may have a woman, right, in a sex discrimination case who has been fired or not promoted based upon how she performs her identity, right? So the employer might prefer a woman who dresses in traditionally feminine ways, and the plaintiff might have more of a masculine gender performance, right? So you point out the ways in which intergroup differences matter in other contexts to convince fact finders that it actually matters when it comes to race and skin color. And that's where the historical data becomes very important, as well as some of the contemporary empirical scholarship being engaged in by economists and sociologists. So there's some education that has to take place, but note that that education is going to be against a background of resistance, right? You have an employer who hired Black folks, and now you're saying that they discriminate among Black people. People will be a little resistant to that, and so education will be required. Another observation that's been made in the cases is, well, when do you know that skin tone differences are salient, right? At what point is someone too dark, right? And crosses the line into undesirability. So some courts have said we don't want to get into the unsavory business of trying to differentiate among skin tones. But you know what? We get into the unsavory business in the law of making fine distinctions in other settings as well. In tort law, whether something is negligent or not, requires some sort of fine-tuned factual analysis. So that argument has been stated, but one can push back against it. I think that the biggest challenge in the cases is people just don't believe, right, that someone who will hire a person of color will then discriminate among people of color. And you've got to educate individuals about that. I will say, Terrell, that there has been an increase in color claims. So the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is a federal commission that basically receives charges of discrimination under a variety of federal anti-discrimination statutes, including Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination in employment. And so we've seen an increase from 1997 to 2016 from 0.9% of their charges being based upon color to 3.4% of their charges being based upon color discrimination claims. That's an increase from about 700, let's say 750 to a little over 3,000 in absolute numbers. It's small, but it's noticeable, right? Because basically before 1997, you had very few pure color claims being brought. And so we've got to see what's happening with these cases and what the complexion of the plaintiffs is like. Many of us have noticed that many of the color discrimination claims are being brought by immigrants from countries where color is more salient, right? So you can't make racial distinctions in a country that's predominantly of one race, but color distinctions have some salience. So some of recent immigrants, from those countries are more likely to bring color claims. I've hypothesized that some of what may be happening is that people are unable to readily place individuals within racial categories today. And so they're using color as a way to identify someone as being other or different, right? So color then in a context where you have more interracial sex and more biracial individuals, people can't easily racially categorize those individuals in all contexts, but color becomes a mechanism for othering someone. And I suspect that may play out in the cases, but we'll have to just, watch and see over time.
All right. That was, very interesting and very much appreciate that. And it was one point that you kind of made about the difficulty of actually winning a discrimination case. And that actually came up in another interview we did with Professor Wendy Green from Cumberland School of Law at Stanford. And we interviewed her and Professor Angela Onwachi-Willig from Berkeley. And they kind of talked about the difficulty of actually winning such cases and how a lot of the work has to be done at the local level, as well as through education and just educating people. And that's one thing I just really appreciate about legal scholars. Your work has a potential to just really educate people and hopefully change the way people are doing things on the job, and people who are really interested in just making a difference or complying with certain things. And
well, Professor Green and Professor Onwachi-Willig are my very good friends. Yeah, and we've done a lot of work on hair in recent months because there have been prohibitions against natural hairstyles in certain schools in the country, and we've been pushing back against that. But this raises a really important point. It's not just skin color. There are other ways in which people within the African American, within the Black community are differentiated, and hair being one of them, right? Whether you wear your hair a natural style or whether it is permed or processed makes a huge difference in some context in terms of how one is treated, right? On the job, in social interactions and so on and so forth. So my recent work is looking at the ways in which skin color overlaps with other dimensions of our identity, and importantly, hair, right? If you're African American, but nose, the broadness of the nose, the shape of the eyes if you're Asian American, right? That plays a huge role. So it's not just one variable. There are all of these ways in which these variables interact to situate individuals differently. But I think that back to your observation, legal scholarship can be useful if we translate it in the right ways and in the right settings. Can I make one final point that may be useful to your listeners? And that is, we need to keep in mind that colorism is not unique to the African American community. It exists within the Latinx community, as does, hair differences. They have a lot of salience within the Latinx community, and globally. So in 2001, I was in Vietnam for the first time in the summer. And it was extraordinarily hot. I was leaving the airport in Hanoi, and I write about this in one of my articles. And I noticed that while I'm sweating and trying to just take off articles of clothing to cool down, I noticed that people working in the rice fields and riding motorcycles and bikes at the time had their faces covered with a scarf and their arms, and some women had on gloves. And I noticed that this was predominantly among women who actually were covered in this way. And I was intrigued because I was hot and I was taking things off and they were clearly covered. So I started asking questions about why women were covered in this way. And the answer that I received, and it's driven some of my scholarship in recent years, is that they were trying to prevent their skin from becoming too dark. And of course, the next question I asked was why? And the answer was that they didn't want to be perceived as being among the lower classes in Vietnam, those who worked and labored in the fields, as opposed to people who worked inside, right, in office jobs, right? So there was a class dimension to what was going on in terms of this privileging of lighter, whiter skin. But there's also a gender component. The women told me that lighter skin toned Vietnamese women were deemed to be more attractive and to do well better in terms of romantic relationships, right? I also noticed that summers I traveled throughout Southeast Asia, started paying attention, right? That there were skin lightening, they're called skin brightening products, everywhere in drugstores and supermarkets, and they were targeted towards individuals, primarily women at the time, although that's shifting and the market is expanding to include men. Basically, advertising white skin. And the products were called White Perfect in Asia and in Southeast Asia, and in South Asia on the Indian subcontinent, I saw Fair and Lovely products. So I started researching what was happening within Asian communities in terms of skin lightening. And to my surprise, and it should not have been a surprise, but we learn as we go, right? The skin lightening business is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and Asia is the primary market, and South Asia is probably the largest market in terms of skin lighteners. So I think that it's important that people realize that this is not just within the United States, it's universal, right, within other communities. And you will see this in places that you might not automatically expect it to exist. So when we start looking critically at what's happening in the United States, it's not about blaming each other. It's about understanding, right, the salience of color in this culture as well as in other cultures.
No, I love that phrase. It's not about blaming. It's about understanding. And I just want to say thank you, Professor Trina Jones, for taking out the time to have this conversation with us. Is there anywhere, any place, or any resources you think our listeners should look out for or should look at, or anywhere to find you if you're on any kind of social media at all?
Well, I am not on social media. But I can be contacted through my business email. That's tjones@law.duke.edu. I hope that people will read my work, especially as I begin to make these connections between color and hair and nose and eye shape and that sort of thing, because I really welcome feedback, right, on these projects. And for people who are not within the African American community, I would really love to learn more about their experiences of colorism or shadeism within the Latinx and in Asian communities as well, because I think that we need to figure out why this is happening in different contexts. Is it always a result of racism, or is there a more explicit gendered and class dimension in other contexts? And if we understand that, can we use it to understand what's happening in the United States with greater nuance? So yeah, I'd really love to hear from people. In terms of resources, in addition to my scholarship, I think that the documentary Dark Girls is a great mechanism for opening up a conversation in, let's say, the educational arena, right, about colorism. So if educators are looking for something that's a little less academic, I think that's a really useful vehicle for having these conversations.
Oh, excellent, excellent. For all our listeners out there, we'll definitely post links and citations to a lot of the sources we discussed. Also, I know we did a lot of name dropping as well, so we'll put the links up to some of those folk as well when we post this on the website, so you can have a one-stop shop on the website when this episode is posted, so you can get all that information. So you can, if you want to, interested in continuing this quest for knowledge in this particular field, we'll definitely try to help you out with that, and also participate in the forums. Because if there are any questions that arise, I'm sure we can either contact Professor Jones again, or do some more research and try to answer some of the questions that may arise from this conversation we're having today.
Well, I'd just like to say thank you so much, Professor Jones, for taking out your time out of your busy day to speak with us. This conversation was just so amazing. It was a good mix of important topics that are just of interest to me because of my positionality as a Black woman who's just interested in these conversations in the community, but also as a PhD student and rising scholar, and who's interested in putting facts and statistics and data to conversations that are important to the Black community. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
I thought it was great. I thought that Trina Jones really was very insightful. It's clear that she's an expert in this area when it comes to colorism, not just with regards to the law, but overall all the context and history behind it and why we are today. She cited many good works. That's how you always can tell if someone is really keeping current with the field, is knowing the works of other people right off the top of their head, it was nothing. So her insight was invaluable, and I think it's an important part to the conversation when we're talking about colorism. So what are your thoughts?
So one thing, yes, I appreciated her knowledge around it. I was also very appreciative of the fact that this is an expanding field of sociological and legal inquiry, that we can move beyond, these conversations that revolve around hurt feelings and anecdotes, and actually look at the data surrounding it. So I appreciate that. But I also appreciated her placing colorism within a global context and allowing us to move beyond this idea that colorism is something that only impacts the Black community. And I'm pretty sure people know that. But when they really think about the fact that in some Asian countries, it is nothing for, skin bleaching cream to be advertised on a TV and on billboards. So, it is something, white supremacist ideology and the bias toward fair skin. It is not an American thing. We are not exceptional in that sense. It is not, a Black thing. It is a thing that we have to deal with globally, and change mindsets around, the link between, success and color, or attractiveness and color, or, just all of the stereotypes that might be associated with light and dark. So I really appreciated her placing that within a global context. And I'll also say that it's interesting because I will say, actually, there's, I guess, a skincare line called The Ordinary or something like that. And the CEO just got into hot water because he had some weird video online. And I think a Black woman commented under the post, "Are you okay, Brandon?" And, that was the extent of her comment. And he was like, "I'm okay, but maybe you should do something about that dark skin." Or no, he told her to use some type of cream. And when you Google the cream, it is a skin lightening, it's a skin lightening ingredient. He was like, when that comes out, maybe you should use that because, your face doesn't look okay, or something to that extent. And, it's interesting because with all of the team light skin, team dark skin colorism that I see within the U.S. Black community, I don't really see people fallen into like the skin bleaching thing, which is huge in certain international communities. So that's interesting to me.
Yeah, I remember watching a documentary a while ago about that. It was, I can't remember which country it was. I think it was South America. And they really have this huge issue dealing with skin bleaching and trying to lighten the color of their skin. Which I think is problematic in a lot of ways. But, going back to what La Negra was talking about in the Breakfast Club, I think this is an issue, not just in America, but in other, especially particular Latin American countries too, of colorism and the like. What I really appreciate from Professor Jones's discussion and interview too was really bringing in the historical implications of it. Even though we have these conversations to date, I think a lot of the times we're not understanding why we're having these conversations. And it's really, to me, ultimately, I just feel like these conversations are not, they're dividing us in a lot of ways. And I just feel like in my eyes, how I've always been is just that, light skin, dark skin, whatever it is, I just always see you as black. Because I just feel like that's how you're always going to be treated. Even if you feel you're not, or in a certain way, I just feel like you're just black. And we all have similar experiences being a black person. But of course, within the community, we do have these debates and the historical aspects of it. Even what I found fascinating was, of course, I think most of us know when we had a conversation about field Negroes and house Negroes, right? From back in the day. I think what I found interesting was that in the South, with the mulattoes from her paper, they were actually treated, closer to whites, because again, most of their fathers or parents were white, right? If they were mixed. And so they wanted to treat them in a better fashion and actually systemically set up ways for them to be kind of higher class than black folk. And then in the North, the mulattoes and the mixed people were treated just like blacks. And it wasn't until the political pressures of the Civil War began to approach where in the South, they began to actually treat mulattoes a little bit more, like black people and separate them from the pack so they can justify these means for slavery. But ultimately, it's never been a ploy to progress black people, right? It's always been a way to separate them for some fashion. I think when we have these discussions and we do divide, ultimately, it's not bringing us together, not looking at the broader issues, right? Does it really matter? Now, from her research, there are issues like still today that are present where we are seeing lighter skinned people getting more advantages in multiple areas like the workplace, maybe even in the law, when it comes to media and movies and acting and actresses and what faces we see most likely are of lighter skin tones, which is the truth. And I think that should be addressed. And on the flip side, I remember she had addressed too, hey, sometimes light skinned people go through some things as well. A lot of times, I've had light skinned friends and dark skinned friends. And a lot of times the narrative I hear from my light skinned friends is this kind of caught in the middle where they're light, but they're not being widely accepted within the white communities. And then within the black communities, they always have to prove their blackness. People are always, oh, you're light skinned, you're not black enough or things of that nature. And so it's a big part of the conversation. I remember when I had first started, even dating my wife, I had a friend make a comment. I was drinking a beer. It was an ale beer. And she had made a comment like, oh, you like your beer like you like your women. And I was like, what? what you mean by that? I said, what?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, she was like, you like your beer like you like your women. And I was like, I don't know how I feel about that. I kind of let it slide. I wasn't going to make a big deal. But it's just like, why would you, feel the need to say that? Again, to me, I see nothing good. We need to have these conversations to, I think, heal, understand, and move forward. But ultimately, when you look at it in the long run, we do need to figure out a way to not make it create division amongst our community. And I think that's what she was saying in there. It shouldn't be seen as a bad thing or somebody's fault in any way for being the skin color they are. It's just like, okay, there are differences. There are things we need to address. So how do we do that together as a community? Because we should want to see each other succeed,
And thinking about that comment, I can just imagine that, I think that there's a lot of trauma and hurt feelings probably on both sides of the color spectrum in the black community, trauma that people experienced in childhood and how they carry that into, adulthood and how, it can become baggage you know, in terms of how they, you know, interact with other people. And I will say that that's an interesting comment that someone could have made about you, because I've known you long enough to know that you have dated women, Black women on, like, you know, every color range. So, yes, you know, that's not a comment that someone could make about you, but it probably stems from what often happens, or what has happened in the media, a lot in terms of people. And honestly, unfortunately, you know, with it being a lot of Black men who come out and feel the need to disparage dark-skinned women as potential dating partners, like calling them dark butts, or, you know, just, and so it's just kind of like, but it's also judge people based on how they act and what they are doing, and don't necessarily place stereotypes on them, you know, based on like a decision that, you know, they're making in that moment. Because we are more than our skin color. We are more than like the people that we date, you know, at a given moment. Like, you know, we come to like everything with different, you know, experiences. Yeah.
Very true. And, you know, it's just like you said, it's like you just said in the beginning of this closing segment, is that, you know, it's a global issue. It's just not something that is pertinent or prevalent within just the African American community. And I think we need to all figure out ways to address this. Even within my own school, I have a lot of students from the DR, and it's just debate, you know, sometimes them feeling like when we talk about the Black community and them living here, they'll say things like, yeah, I'm not Black. You know, I don't consider myself Black, even though their skin is, of course, as Black as everyone, right? Black folk, period. But they don't identify with it and don't feel like they may have the same experiences as the Blacks that live in this country, or African Americans in particular. And so we need to have more conversations about this. And I think this was a good start. And I would, you know, really hope that you all really give us some feedback of questions you may have, because we would like to answer it. We would like to bring more people in if necessary, you know, to answer some of these questions or get more feedback. Because this is not going to be the only time we talk about this, for sure. Because it's such a big issue. We would definitely want to even get, if you know anyone that can give us, or that studies the experiences of, you know, the Afro-Latino experience, because that's a large part of what happened on the Breakfast Club with La Negra as well. It wasn't just in the American experience. It's kind of what goes on there. And I think we need to shed light on that, because I can remember, you know, when I was in graduate school, I met a friend that was, she was Black, she looked Black, and then when she started talking, she had this accent, and I got confused, and I was like, where's this accent from? And you know, she was like, oh, I'm from Colombia. I was like, oh, okay. There are Black people in Colombia. It was really shocking to me. And we had this real conversations, and, you know, she shed light, like, you know, really look at the Latinos that come to this country. And when I looked at them, I was like, you know, they are really fair skin and light skin. And, you know, she would say that, yeah, many of the people who have Black skin in these Latin countries or wherever don't make it over to the United States, because there's still forms of oppression based on skin color going on there. And that was really eye-opening to me. And I was like, wow, that makes a lot of sense. And so, you know, that's just evidence that we need to have more of these conversations, for sure.
And also, it's funny because with that same, you know, experience, or that same friend, also seeing that there, you know, are differences across even, you know, Latin American countries and communities with embracing Blackness. So, like, you know, I actually spent Thanksgiving with a group of Black Colombians, and they were all like, oh, I'm Black, and, you know, very much comfortable and very much embracing of their identity as Black Latinos. And so it's, you know, it's not always the same with like Latinos distancing themselves from Blackness. And I think that's why it is important to have those discussions and have those stories, because, you know, we have to stop judging people based on, you know, these stereotypes or, you know, characteristics, and not really getting deep into their stories to figure out, you know, what's behind it all, and what shapes identity. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. So this clearly, by this conversation we have here, there's a lot more we're going to need to talk about, and we will for sure. But we definitely greatly appreciate you all, like we say every week, for tuning in, for subscribing, for listening. Continue to please give us feedback. Email us whatever questions you have at bhdpodcast@gmail.com. At BHD Podcast is our social media handles on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Reach out to us. Go to our website, www.blackandhighlydangerous.com. Participate in forums. Whatever it is, whatever feedback, whatever the questions you have, whatever topics you want us to discuss, continue to reach out to us. And of course, rate and review on iTunes and everywhere else. And just, like I said, share us, pass us around. Don't keep us a secret. We don't want to be a secret at all. We want everybody to know about us and be informed. And we want to be a resource to as many people we can reach. For sure.
Agreed. Thank you for listening. And again, also email us any topics. What do you want to hear about? What do you want us to have conversations about or grab resources or research about? Let us know.
Mm-hmm. And if there are people you want us to reach out to specifically that you feel like, you would love to hear on an interview and hear their perspective on things, let us know. Not to guarantee that we'll get them, but we will really try to get them. Sometimes being in the settings we have, being a professor and stuff like that, people will pay a little bit more attention to our emails when they come their way. So we might have a better chance of getting them on the air and answering the questions you want asked specifically and directly to them. But as always, thank you for listening. Continue to listen, spread the word.
If you're interested in continuing this and other conversations, visit our website, blackandhighlydangerous.com, to subscribe to our email list, suggest topics, and participate in our discussion forums.
Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at BHD Podcast. And please don't forget to subscribe and rate our podcast on your favorite platform. And as always, continue to be the oppressors